So I guess, a question that arises that I think is really important for this whole debate, and especially the debate around what quality is or what is the most sort of sustainable diet, particularly in societal terms. What would you say, and we may disagree on this, I'm not sure, but what would you say is the biggest issue regarding the diabesity epidemic? Would you say that it's carbohydrate or hyperpalatable, ultra-refined food?
Well, that's a very good question, and there are different schools of thought. Different people I know have different ideas on that. What I tend to fall back to for questions such as this is I tend to fall back on my own experience and understanding and answering in the context of what actually worked for me. When I started on my weight loss journey, I took the idea of low carb very, very literally. I wasn't at all concerned with the extent of the processing of the food, how real or packaged it was. I was simply looking at the food labels, looking at the numbers on the back of the food labels, how many carbohydrates per 100 grams according to the label. Me with my sort of engineering, mathematical problem-solving mindset, that was as simple as approach as I could take. I would wander through the supermarket. The first day I went supermarket shopping after I committed to low carb took me all afternoon. I'm stopping and looking at these food labels and understanding, I can't eat that anymore. But then I come across...
Yeah, I remember you saying it took half a day, but you had half a day
to
spare.
Yeah, I had half a day to spare. I gave myself that time. So I wandered around and I learned and I unlearned and I relearned. There are some things that I thought I hadn't had in years, and I can actually have that now by the label. That looks okay. So I took a very literal approach to low carb in that sense, paying no regard whatsoever to the extent of the processing of things. In my case, it worked out that they weren't very different from each other anyway. There was a lot of removal of processed food from the old diet, in that, there's no more pizza, no more pies, no more 2-minute noodles, no more cereals, all those sorts of things, obviously. And they're all replaced largely by meat and veggies. So it's broadly, headed down the direction of a more whole food diet anyway. Not to say that I'm fully whole food in that sense. I'll have the odd low carb energy bar or a drink with a bit of stevia in it or something like that. I don't get too particular about that. The primary focus for me was just getting the carbs down. Once I'd understood that the insulin response that the carbs produce was the barrier for me internally, I needed to get the insulin down to such a level that the body was capable of burning that which I was already carrying. So I really did target the carbs in the early stages. At this point, some years into my maintenance period, I suppose, I've been more or less weight stable now for about 5 years. The question of quality around the extent of the processing of the food has begun to emerge of its own accord as I'm continually looking to tweak things and make changes. Processed meat versus unprocessed meat. Do I really need the energy bars? Do I really need the coconut cream desserts or whatever? And that's just a trial and error thing. So I would argue that for me, while the initial focus was very much about the carb restriction first and foremost, there's such a large overlap between the carbs literally versus just the quality of the food in terms of whole foods and processed foods. The overlap is pretty large anyway for me.
Definitely. I think that's something we see commonly is that when people embark on a low-carb diet, not always, but generally, people will tend to eat a diet that is lower in those ultra-refined, hyper-palatable foods, higher in sort of natural, whole, unprocessed foods, and, by nature, the diet is very satiating anyway, but also, the foods that people are eating are by nature satiating as well. So I think we're sort of functionally achieving that auto-regulation, maybe in a way that people didn't necessarily expect, because from my point of view, I think that while I don't believe that the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity has been completely debunked, but it's certainly very incomplete, especially given some of the later research, which shows fairly clearly that there is very little, if any, difference between, higher or lower carb diets over the longer term. and that high-carb diets can, in fact, of certain types, particularly when they're based on unrefined foods, can be just as satiating as a low-carb or ketogenic diet. But I think all of the debate around that is interesting from an academic sense, but in a functional sense for the person on the street, what's going to work for them is what's going to work for them.
Yeah.
And the reality is that, low carb works incredibly well for a lot of people, and particularly so people who have metabolic syndrome or are on that pathway.